We imagine the Colosseum as a stage of glory, where gladiators fought with courage and the crowd roared in awe. But what if I told you the real horror began after the fights ended? When the applause faded, the arena turned into a theater of cruelty, where prisoners, slaves, and the unwanted were fed to beasts, burned alive, or forced into games so degrading that ancient writers barely dared to record them. For the gladiator, death was quick, almost merciful. But for the outcasts dragged into Rome's cruelest shows, the arena was not a place of honor. It was a slow, public execution of their humanity. You think you know the Colosseum, but what you're about to discover is the side of Rome that even history tried to silence. We often imagine the Colosseum as a monument of Roman glory, a place where gladiators fought for honor and immortality. But its origins were far less glamorous. The earliest spectacles began not as entertainment, but as funeral rites, blood offerings meant to honor the dead. Over time, this ritual of death shifted from a sacred duty into a public obsession. By the time the empire reached its height, the arena had become the beating heart of Roman mass culture. For emperors, the arena was more than a place of games. It was a tool of power. A ruler could silence unrest or win the adoration of the mob with a few days of blood spectacles. Juvenal, in his biting satires, accused the people of Rome of caring only for bread and circuses. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, described emperors who secured their rule not with speeches or reforms, but with the roar of the crowd and the sight of blood on the sand. The scale was staggering. The Colosseum alone could hold upwards of 50,000 spectators, tiered according to status, from senators in marble seats near the arena floor to commoners packed in the highest rows. And it wasn't only Rome. Archaeologists have uncovered over 200 amphitheaters scattered across the empire, from the sands of North Africa to the rainy hills of Britain. Each city, no matter how distant, sought to mimic the capital by offering its citizens the intoxicating promise of blood spectacle. When we think of the Roman arena, the image that comes to mind is the duel of gladiators, two warriors clashing with sword and shield until one lay dead. But gladiatorial combat was only part of the program, and often not even the most shocking. The Romans used the word spectacular, spectacles, to describe an entire menu of violence served throughout the day. The morning hours belonged to the venations, elaborate hunts in which exotic animals were released into the arena to be slain by trained hunters. Mosaics from villas in North Africa still show these scenes. Lions, leopards, even crocodiles pitted against men armed with spears and nets. For the crowd, it was not just a test of skill, but a theater of empire itself, proof that Rome could capture beasts from the farthest corners of the known world. As midday approached, the games grew darker. This was the time reserved for executions, when criminals, prisoners of war, and those condemned for treason were put to death before the eyes of tens of thousands. Only after the crowd had feasted on this brutal appetizer did the main course arrive, the gladiatorial duels in the evening. By then, the sand was already soaked in blood, and the crowd, already desensitized, demanded ever greater savagery. If the morning hunts were a demonstration of Rome's reach, the midday executions were a demonstration of its cruelty. Known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, this was no swift death. Criminals, deserters, rebels, and even Christians were paraded into the arena unarmed, sometimes dressed in rags or mock costumes and left to face lions, leopards, or bears. The crowd did not come for justice. They came for a spectacle. Ancient writers did not hide the scale of this brutality. Suetonius, in his Lives of the Caesars, tells us that Emperor Titus once staged games in which 5,000 wild animals were killed in a single day. These were not contests, but slaughter on an industrial scale, designed to leave an unforgettable impression on the audience. To Rome, killing was not just punishment, it was performance. Modern archaeology has given us haunting confirmation. At amphitheater sites across the empire, from Italy to North Africa, bones have been unearthed, showing the marks of this gruesome practice. Human remains bear the crushing fractures and tearing gashes consistent with animal maulings. In some cases, gnaw marks from lions and leopards can still be traced on ancient skeletons. These victims did not die quickly. They were torn apart before the eyes of tens of thousands. Their agony stretched into the rhythm of public entertainment, and the crowd applauded. The Romans prided themselves on their theater, but in the arena, even myth became a matter of life and death. Criminals sentenced to execution were sometimes forced to perform famous legends, not with actors' tricks or painted scenery, but with their own bodies and their own blood. The poet Martial, in his collection De Spectaculis, describes these ghastly reenactments. One condemned man was made to play Orpheus, the mythical musician who could charm wild beasts with his lyre. But instead of taming the animals, the man was set upon by a bear, torn apart before the laughing crowd. Another was cast as Icarus, strapped into makeshift wings and hurled from the arena ceiling to plummet to his death on the sand. Others were forced into the role of Hercules, chained and burned alive in a staged funeral pyre, their screams echoing through the Colosseum. These were not plays, they were executions disguised as theatre. The condemned had no lines to recite, no chance of survival, only a role to die in. For the spectators, the shock lay in the realism. Gods and heroes brought low, played by living men whose suffering was all too real. In Rome, myth was not entertainment. It was a death sentence performed for applause. If criminals and outcasts filled the roles of myth, prisoners of war became the disposable cast of Rome's grandest spectacles. For the empire, conquest did not end on the battlefield. The defeated were paraded in triumphal processions, enslaved, and often sent to die in the arenas. Their fate was not just death, but humiliation, made to fight staged battles with no armor, no training, and no chance of survival. Ancient accounts tell of entire groups of captives massacred in choreographed slaughter. The historian Josephus, writing about the aftermath of the Jewish revolt in the 1st century CE, describes how thousands of Jewish prisoners were dragged to Rome and forced to fight in the arenas. They were not trained gladiators. They were survivors of war, turned into entertainment for the victors who had crushed their homeland. Sometimes the scale defies belief. Amphitheaters could be flooded with water to stage mock sea battles called naumachii. In one such spectacle, more than 1,000 prisoners were forced into boats to reenact famous naval battles. With real weapons and no escape, the outcome was a massacre staged for cheers. Cassius Dio records that the lakes and artificial basins built for these events ran red with the blood of those who had already lost everything. To the Romans, these human lives were nothing more than props, bodies to be spent in the name of imperial theatre. The Roman arena did not spare the most vulnerable. While men made up the majority of those killed in spectacles, ancient sources and archaeology reveal that women and even children were sometimes forced into the sand. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, describes with chilling brevity how Emperor Nero ordered women and children condemned to death to be thrown to wild beasts. These victims were not warriors or criminals in the traditional sense. Many were slaves, political prisoners, or simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their deaths were not only meant to punish, but to shock, to remind the crowd that Rome's power recognized no boundaries of age or gender. There is also evidence, though rare, of women fighting in the arena. Inscriptions and reliefs discovered in Halicarnassus record the existence of gladiatrices, female gladiators who fought either against one another or against animals. While some were trained, many were condemned women, forced into roles designed to humiliate as much as to kill. Their presence blurred the line between spectacle and scandal, as Roman society debated whether such scenes were thrilling or disgraceful. For the modern reader, perhaps the most haunting realization is this: even children, who should have been protected by innocence, were treated as expendable actors in Rome's theater of cruelty. In the pursuit of entertainment, the empire devoured its own most helpless lives. The Romans believed that true power was measured not only in conquered peoples, but in conquered nature. Nowhere was this more visible than in the parade of exotic animals that filled the arenas. Lions from North Africa, elephants from India, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes, whose strange forms must have seemed almost mythical to Roman eyes, all were dragged across continents to die before the crowd. These spectacles carried enormous economic costs. Governors and provincial officials were often bankrupted, trying to procure beasts rare enough to impress the mob. Records show that animals were captured in distant lands, transported by ship and caravan, and kept in cages for months or even years before their final display. Some died en route. Others arrived half-starved, only to be slain within minutes of release. The sheer scale of this carnage is staggering. Augustus once staged a festival in which 3,500 animals were killed, while later emperors competed to outdo him in excess. Suetonius and other writers record festivals where the sand ran thick with the blood of thousands of creatures, their deaths greeted with the same applause as the fall of a gladiator. What began as demonstrations of Roman dominion over nature quickly became contests of extravagance, with each emperor striving to prove that no expense and no life, human or animal, was too great a price for spectacle. The arena was not only about killing, it was about humiliation. Condemned men and women were paraded before the crowd, stripped not just of weapons, but of dignity. Sometimes they were forced to wear ridiculous costumes, mocked as they stumbled into the sand. Other times, they were made to beg for mercy, knowing none would come. The cruelty was not only physical, it was psychological, staged to maximize shame before death. The philosopher Seneca, in one of his letters, described his disgust after witnessing the midday executions. At midday, he wrote, they throw men with no armor to the beasts or to each other, death with no honor. To him, these were not contests, but butchery. The victims were not given the dignity of a fight, but were killed slowly, as if the suffering itself was the performance. Not all Romans approved. Among the elite, some voices rose in criticism, warning that the spectacles were corrupting the very fabric of society. They argued that watching human beings torn apart for entertainment hardened the hearts of citizens, turning cruelty into a pastime. Yet despite these protests, the games only grew larger, bloodier, and more elaborate. The cheers of the masses drowned out the doubts of the few. For the ordinary spectator, the humiliation of the condemned was part of the attraction. It was not enough to see them die. The crowd wanted to see them broken. For centuries, much of what we knew about the Roman arena came from poets, historians, and moralists. But in the last 100 years, archaeology and science have pulled back the curtain, revealing physical traces of the brutality hidden beneath the ruins. In Pompeii, excavations of a gladiator barracks uncovered tiny, cramped cells where fighters lived in prison-like conditions. Graffiti scrawled on the walls shows desperate boasts and prayers, while the skeletons found nearby bear the marks of repeated fractures, bones broken and healed again, evidence of men forced back into the arena long after their bodies should have given out. Scientific studies of these remains have revealed still more. Bone analysis shows signs of malnutrition, despite the so-called gladiator diet described in ancient sources. Some skeletons show repeated head trauma and blade wounds that healed, suggesting a cycle of training, fighting, and surviving until the day survival finally ran out. Even the Colosseum itself has given up its secrets. Soil tests taken from beneath the arena floor revealed traces of animal dung, ash, and human blood proteins mixed into the very sand. These microscopic fragments confirm what ancient writers described: the mingling of human and beast, fire and steel, all churned together in the dirt where thousands of lives were spent, where words sometimes sought to glorify. The ground itself testifies to the reality. Rome's greatest monument was also its greatest slaughterhouse. The arena was more than entertainment. It was the state's most public stage of cruelty. Every spectacle was sanctioned by the authorities, funded by emperors and magistrates, and justified as tradition. While Roman law spoke in lofty terms of justice and civic duty, The law of the arena was something else entirely. Humiliation, blood, and death packaged as spectacle. This hidden contrast is one of history's great paradoxes. The same empire that gave us sophisticated legal codes, aqueducts, and engineering wonders also normalized the slaughter of humans and animals for amusement. The Colosseum, admired today as an architectural marvel, was built as much with mortar and stone as with blood and bone. So what should we remember? Do we admire Rome for its endurance, its culture, and its grandeur? Or do we measure its greatness against the cost, the nameless prisoners, slaves, women, and children who died in the sand for the pleasure of the crowd? The next time you see the Colosseum in a photograph or stand before its towering arches, ask yourself, is this a monument to Roman glory or a graveyard of forgotten lives? If you found this story worth uncovering, make sure to subscribe. It helps us continue bringing these hidden histories to light. And let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Let's see how far the memory of Rome's arenas has traveled.